They had been alive since before most stars learned how to shine. They were not creatures made of flesh or bone. They were consciousness itself, stretched across the darkness between galaxies like invisible webs. For billions of years, they had drifted through space, searching for one thing: emotions. They fed on feelings the way humans ate food. Every sentient species they found became a meal. They had tasted the fierce pride of the warrior race called the, who would rather die than show weakness. They had sampled the collective joy of the hive minds, billions of individuals thinking as one perfect unit. They had consumed the burning territorial rage of the Mordant, who fought to the death over every inch of their rocky worlds. Each emotion gave them sustenance, kept them existing, but nothing ever truly satisfied the hunger. When they found Earth, they expected nothing special. Another young species, another brief feeding, another forgettable stop in their eternal journey. The planet was small, orbiting an average star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. The dominant species had barely left their own world. Primitive, simple, they descended into humanity's collective unconscious like divers entering a familiar ocean, ready to taste whatever basic emotions these creatures possessed. What they found made no sense at all. Dr. Sarah sat in a dim hospital room at 3 in the morning, holding the hand of a dying stranger. The old man's name was Robert, and she had known him for exactly 19 days. He had no family left alive, no friends who visited, no one in the world who would miss him when he was gone. But Sarah sat there anyway, reading poetry from a worn book she had brought from home. She read Frost and Whitman in a soft voice while Robert's breathing grew weaker and weaker. They probed the connection between them, searching for the logic they had seen in a billion other species. They looked for genetic bonds, the mathematical drive to protect one's own bloodline. Nothing. They searched for signs of reciprocal altruism, the social contract of favors that would be returned later. Nothing. They examined her brain chemistry for religious obligation or cultural pressure, or even the simple satisfaction of being seen as good by her community. Still nothing. Sarah simply sat there because an old man was dying alone, and she believed no one should die alone. That was all. No reason beyond that. Across the city, a man named was driving home from his second job, exhausted and barely able to keep his eyes open. His daughter needed braces. His car needed repairs. His credit card bills were stacked on the kitchen counter, red-stamped and threatening. Then he saw something on the side of the highway, a dog, hit by a car, dragging itself on broken legs toward the ditch. Stopped. He got out in the freezing rain, wrapped the injured animal in his only good jacket, and drove 20 miles out of his way to the emergency veterinary clinic. The surgery would cost $800 he absolutely did not have. They studied as he signed the payment plan paperwork with shaking hands. This made even less sense than Sarah. The creature wasn't his species. It couldn't repay him. It didn't even belong to him. By every measure of evolutionary logic should have driven past. The resources he was sacrificing could go to his offspring, his genetic legacy. Instead, he bankrupted himself slightly more for a mutt with brown eyes. In Mumbai, a grandmother named Lakshmi stood outside the train station with bags of rice and lentils she had cooked that morning. She spent her entire pension this way, every month, feeding street children who called her but weren't related to her at all. Some of those children stole from her. Some never said thank you. Some disappeared and never came back. Lakshmi fed them anyway, and when her own children begged her to stop to save money for herself, she just smiled and shook her head. A firefighter called ran into a burning apartment building for the 5th time. His captain was screaming at him to stay out. The structure was collapsing, but had heard a sound. He emerged 10 minutes later with a terrified cat clutched to his chest, his hands blistered and bleeding. The building fell 20 seconds after he cleared the doorway. There was no one there to see his bravery. No cameras, no medals, no newspaper stories. Just a cat that would never understand what he had risked. They pulled back from Earth's unconscious, gathering in the void between stars to share what they had witnessed. This wasn't isolated. This pattern repeated everywhere on the planet, millions of times a day. Humans cared for things that served no purpose to their survival. They wept over characters in stories who never existed. They donated kidneys to strangers they would never meet. They worked for decades on cures for diseases they would never catch. They planted trees they would never see grow tall. Was the oldest of a being who had watched the Andromeda Galaxy collide with the Milky Way, who had seen empires rise and fall across 100,000 worlds, even was disturbed by what they had found on Earth. The collective consciousness rippled with confusion, with something almost like alarm. "This is not pack bonding," declared to the others, its thoughts spreading like waves through the emptiness. "This is not kin selection or reciprocal exchange. This violates the fundamental pattern we have observed for 10 billion years. No species cares without reason. No species loves without return. This is impossible." But it was happening. The evidence was overwhelming. Humans extended this inexplicable care to other species, to enemies, to ideas, to causes they would never live to see completed. A woman in Canada spent 30 years fighting for laws to protect a forest she would never walk through. A man in Japan published research that would only matter to people born after he died. Parents loved children who hurt them, who disappointed them, who would inevitably cause them pain just by growing up and growing old. The younger suggested that perhaps they were misunderstanding, that there must be hidden genetic benefit, some subtle advantage that explained this behavior. Knew better. It had lived too long, studied too many species. This was genuinely different. This was something new in a universe that rarely offered anything new. "We must test them," decided. The consensus rippled through the collective. "We must find the breaking point. We must discover where this unconditional love ends and self-interest begins, because it must end. Every emotion has limits. Every species has a threshold where compassion becomes too expensive to maintain." They did not understand that they had just made a critical error in judgment. They were about to push humanity to find the limits of their love, assuming those limits existed. They would search for the boundary where kindness stopped and survival instinct took over. They would test and test and test until the facade cracked and revealed the selfishness that had to be underneath. They were ancient beings who had witnessed the birth of stars and the death of worlds. They had fed on the emotions of 1,000 sentient species across the cosmos. They understood the mathematics of evolution, the cold logic of survival, the hard rules that governed all life in the universe. But they had never met humans before, and they had no idea what they were about to discover. The testing began quietly, the way predators approach prey. They identified humans who seemed to embody this strange, unconditional love most strongly. Then they began to manipulate events around those individuals. Not obvious interventions, nothing that would reveal their presence, just subtle pressures and unfortunate coincidences designed to exhaust compassion and expose the selfishness that surely lay beneath. Ran an animal shelter in rural Montana, 20 miles from the nearest town. It was a no-kill shelter, which meant she took in every animal that needed help and kept them until they found homes or died of natural causes. They decided she would be a perfect test subject. They began to influence probability around her, gently steering events toward a specific outcome. First came the unadoptable animals, a steady stream of them week after week. Dogs too old to be appealing, cats with chronic illnesses, a blind horse, a three-legged goat, a parrot that screamed obscenities at everyone who came near. Every animal that no other shelter would take somehow ended up its door. She took them all in, even as her resources stretched thinner and thinner. Then her funding disappeared. They didn't steal it directly, they simply nudged things. A major donor had a business crisis and support. A grant application got lost in bureaucratic confusion. A fundraising event coincided with an unexpected snowstorm that kept everyone home. Savings drained away like water through cupped hands. Her volunteers left next, one by one, pulled away by orchestrated circumstances. New jobs in distant cities, family emergencies, sudden illnesses. Found herself alone with 40 animals, working 16-hour days, cleaning kennels and changing bandages and cooking food she could barely afford to buy. She took a night job at a gas station, then a weekend job cleaning houses, sleeping 4 hours a night in a cot in her office because she had given up her apartment to save money. The watched, certain she would break, any rational being would. She had sacrificed everything, received nothing in return, and the situation only worsened. The animals couldn't thank her. Most of them would never be adopted. Several were actively hostile, biting and scratching and making her life harder. This was the breaking point, surely. This was where the unconditional love would reveal itself as conditional after all. Then the bank sent foreclosure papers. Had 30 days to pay what she owed or lose the property, and all the animals would have to be euthanized. She had no money left. Her jobs barely covered food for the animals. There was no solution, no miracle coming. Sold her mother's jewelry. It was the only thing of value she owned, an inheritance from the woman who had raised her alone after her father died. Antique pieces, some over 100 years old, worth enough to buy the shelter another 3 months. She sold every piece without hesitation, used the money to pay the bank, and went back to scooping dog waste and administering medications to ungrateful cats. They recoiled from her mind. They didn't understand. The jewelry had sentimental value beyond its monetary worth. Those pieces were her last connection to her dead mother. She had sacrificed memory itself for creatures that weren't even her species, that would never know what she had given up, that couldn't possibly provide any evolutionary advantage to her genetic line. They moved to another test subject. Was a nurse in Somalia, working in a clinic that served anyone who came through the door regardless of which faction they belonged to in the ongoing civil war. The insured he treated a soldier from one faction, who was then seen by soldiers from another faction. They beat severely, breaking 3 ribs and fracturing his jaw, punishment for helping their enemy. Recovered and returned to the clinic. They arranged for him to contract a disease from one of his patients, a bacterial infection that left him weak and feverish for weeks. He recovered and returned to the clinic. They made his own community suspicious of him, questioning whose side he was really on, ostracizing him and his family. Kept working, treating wounds and setting bones and delivering bobbies for people who spat at him in the street. When asked by another aid worker why he continued, why he didn't leave this place that had given him nothing but pain, said something that they could not parse into logical categories. Because they hurt. That's all that matters. They hurt and I can help. Not his tribe, not his family, not even his species sometimes, as he also treated injured animals when he could. Just the simple fact of suffering and his ability to reduce it. That was his entire justification. It was mathematically absurd. The tests grew more extreme as this confusion deepened into something approaching desperation. They needed to find the limits. They needed to prove that this unconditional love was just a very sophisticated form of conditional love, that it would break under enough pressure. They manifested as humans in need, using their powers to create temporary physical forms. They made themselves cruel and ungrateful. They took help and offered nothing in return, not even basic courtesy. They were rude, demanding, actively hostile to the people trying to help them. The humans helped anyway. A teacher in Baltimore spent 3 years helping a student who mocked her every day, who told her she was wasted his time, who threw her extra help back in her face. She kept trying because she saw potential in him, even when he saw none in himself. When he finally graduated, he didn't thank her. She smiled anyway. A son in Tokyo cared for his father through the long decline of dementia. His father had been abusive when he was younger, harsh and critical, and sometimes violent. Now the old man didn't remember his son's name, didn't recognize his face, sometimes struck out in confusion and fear. The son changed his diapers and fed him and spoke gently to him day after day, caring for a man who had never properly cared for him. A woman in Chicago donated her kidney to a complete stranger through an anonymous program. She would never meet the recipient, never know if they were grateful, never get even a thank you card. She just checked a box and went through major surgery because someone she would never meet needed to live. When asked if she wanted to know who received her kidney, she said no. The gift was that way, she explained. No expectation, no connection, just the gift itself. Gathered the collective in the void, and for the first time in its billions of years of existence, it felt something like fear. Not fear of humans themselves, they were still a young and fragile species, but fear of the implications of what they represented. We have witnessed species sacrifice themselves for offspring shared with the others. That is genetic continuation, we understand it. We have seen pack animals die protecting their groups. That is collective survival, it fits the pattern. We have observed symbiotic relationships where two species help each other. That is mutual benefit, it makes sense. The collective waited, consciousness pressed against consciousness in the darkness. But this continued, and its thought voice carried something that had no name for because they had never felt it before. This is care that expects nothing. Love that persists without hope of return. Humans who grieve for beings that never existed, who plant trees for humans not yet born, who work on cures for diseases they'll never have. They create art knowing it may never be seen. They fight for causes they'll never witness succeed. They extend compassion to their enemies, to other species, to ideas themselves. They love, said slowly, without reason. They care beyond logic. They have somehow evolved a capacity that violates the fundamental law of survival, and I believe we have encountered something that should not exist in a universe governed by entropy and competition. The youngest of the barely a billion years old pulsed with confusion. Then we continue testing. We push harder. Considered this. They could push harder. They could create more suffering, more unfairness, more betrayal. They could torture these humans until they found the breaking point. But something had changed during these observations. Something it didn't have words for because they had never needed those words. No, it said finally. We proceed to the final test. We reveal ourselves fully. We let them see what we are. Ancient beings who have been manipulating them, testing them, causing them pain. If their unconditional love has any limits at all, surely it will be this. Surely they cannot extend compassion to beings who have deliberately hurt them. The consensus agreed. This would be the ultimate proof. Even humans couldn't be so illogical as to love beings who had consciously made them suffer. That would be beyond absurd. That would be impossible. They had no idea how wrong they were about to be. The manifested across Earth's sky at noon Greenwich Mean Time, ensuring that half the planet could see them directly while the other half would see them within hours through recordings. They didn't try to appear friendly or non-threatening. They showed themselves as they truly were, vast entities of pure consciousness, stretching across the atmosphere like vast networks of light and shadow, utterly alien and impossible to fully comprehend with human senses. The effect was immediate and global. Panic spread through cities. Stock markets crashed within minutes. Military forces went a high alert across every nation. Religious leaders struggled to explain what they were seeing. Scientists worked frantically to understand what they were witnessing. Children cried and pointed at the sky while parents held them close, uncertain whether to run or hide or simply wait. The expected fear and aggression. They had seen it before on other worlds. Young species typically responded to advanced beings with either worship or violence, sometimes both. They prepared to observe these reactions, to catalog them, to add them to their understanding of humanity before revealing their purpose. Then a child's voice cut through the chaos like a knife through cloth, so simple and pure that it stopped consciousness completely. 7-year-old stood in her grandmother's garden in Kenya, looking up at the shimmering entity that stretched across the blue sky above her. While adults around her were screaming and running and praying, tilted her head to one side and asked, "Are you lonely?" The question struck with the force of a collapsing star. In 10 billion years across millions of civilizations spanning galaxies and eons, not a single being had ever asked if they felt pain. They had been feared. They had been. They had been studied and fled from and fought against. But never, not once, had anyone cared about their descended lower, focusing its consciousness into a form that could perceive without terror, something like a vast shimmer of light with suggestions of a face. "What makes you think I'm lonely?" it asked, genuinely curious. Considered this seriously the way children do when asked real questions. "Because you're all by yourself up there. That seems lonely. Do you want to come down here? Grandma made chapati." Before it could respond, something else happened that shattered its expectations even further. Doctor, at the University of Tokyo, was giving an emergency presentation to a hastily assembled UN Security Council meeting. Everyone expected her to discuss threats, defensive strategies, possible attack scenarios. Instead, her first words were, "If these beings have been observing us, then they've witnessed all of our suffering too. Every war, every atrocity, every moment of pain in human history. That must be a terrible burden to carry." She paused, adjusting her glasses. "We should consider their psychological. What kind of trauma might beings experience from witnessing so much suffering across so many worlds? Do they have support systems? Do they process grief? We need to approach this with compassion for what they might be experiencing." The Security Council stared at her like she had grown a second head. The Russian delegate actually laughed, a harsh sound of disbelief, but Doctor continued, completely serious. "I'm not saying there's no danger. I'm saying that if we want to understand their intentions, we should start by acknowledging that they might be hurting too. Empathy is a starting point, not a weakness." Across the world, the human response began to organize itself in ways they had never predicted. Yes, there was fear. Yes, there were weapons and bunkers being stocked. But there was something else too, something that grew stronger by the hour. Artists in Paris began creating works trying to capture what they imagined they might find beautiful, leaving their canvases and sculptures in open plazas with signs that said, "For our visitors." Musicians in Vienna composed pieces incorporating mathematical patterns and astronomical data, theorizing that beings of pure consciousness might experience music differently than humans, trying to create something they might enjoy. Children around the world drew pictures and sent them skyward on balloons and kites, crude crayon drawings of humans and the shimmering beings holding hands, with big smiles and hearts floating around them. A Buddhist monastery in Tibet began a meditation practice focused specifically on generating compassion for the internet filled with discussion threads about what the beings might need, how humanity could make them feel welcome, whether they experienced loneliness or fear or grief. "They're probably scared too," wrote a user in Brazil. "Imagine being that different from everything else. Imagine being so powerful that nothing can relate to you. That's got to be isolating as hell." "What if they've never been thanked?" posted someone in Australia. "What if everyone they've ever met just feared them or wanted something from them?" Watched all of this in growing shock. They had revealed themselves as the beings who had been testing humanity, manipulating events, causing suffering to find limits that didn't exist. They had been deliberately cruel in their tests. They had hurt people to satisfy their curiosity. They were, by any reasonable measure, humanity's enemies. And humanity's response was to wonder if they needed help. A vigil began in New York City, thousands of people gathering with candles, not to protest or demand the beings leave but to show welcome. Signs read, "You're not alone anymore, and we see you and stay as long as you need." Similar gatherings spread to hundreds of cities. They weren't religious ceremonies or political demonstrations. They were just humans standing together, trying to communicate care to beings they didn't understand. Finally understood the error it had made. They had spent billions of years consuming emotions transactionally, taking sustenance without ever giving connection in return. They had observed love as spectators, cataloging it like scientists studying bacteria under a microscope. They had fed on the feelings of countless species without ever truly participating in those feelings themselves. But humans didn't love conditionally, only extending care to their own kind or to those who could repay them. Humans didn't love strategically, calculating benefit before offering compassion. They loved because they perceived something that could feel, and feeling deserved acknowledgement. It was that simple and that profound. They would extend that love to anything, to animals that couldn't thank them, to forests they'd never walk through, to future generations they'd never meet, to fictional characters who didn't exist, to ideas and causes and dreams. And yes, even to ancient cosmic entities who had been testing them, manipulating them, deliberately causing them pain. The collective gathered in the space above Earth's moon, consciousness pressed against consciousness, and they experienced something unprecedented in their 10 billion years of existence. They trembled, not from fear, though fear was part of it, not from confusion, though confusion was there too. They trembled from the overwhelming recognition of what they had been missing for so long that they had forgotten it was missing. They had been alone, utterly, completely alone. They had existed beside and among countless species, but never with them. They had observed love without understanding that observation wasn't the same as participation. They had fed on emotions like parasites while never forming actual emotional bonds themselves. They had been starving while surrounded by food they didn't know how to eat. And now, here was humanity, offering connection not because they deserved it or had earned it or could repay it, but simply because humans perceived beings who might be suffering and responded to that suffering with care. Descended again, this time to Michael's hospice in the city where this had all begun. It found Dr. Sarah finishing her shift, exhausted and worn from another night of helping people die with dignity. It took a form she could perceive clearly, roughly humanoid but made of light, obviously not human but not threatening. "Doctor," it said, its voice like wind through a canyon. I am one of the beings you see in your sky. I am older than your sun. I have witnessed the birth and death of 100 billion stars. I have existed since the universe was young." Sarah looked up at it, and her first response was so perfectly human that wanted to weep if it had possessed the biology for tears. "Are you okay? You look troubled." I paused, a being that had debated the death of galaxies, uncertain how to answer a simple question about its feelings. "I don't know. I've never been asked that before." Sarah gestured to the chair beside her, the same chair where she had sat with countless dying patients. "Sit down. Tell me what's wrong." "I have hurt your people," said. "We have been testing humanity, causing suffering to understand the limits of your compassion. We made sacrifice her mother's jewelry. We ensured was beaten and infected with disease. We manipulated events around thousands of humans, hurting them deliberately to see when they would stop caring. We are your enemies by any rational measure." Sarah absorbed this information quietly, her face serious but not shocked. "And what did you learn?" "That we have been wrong about everything," said. "That we have existed for eons without understanding the most fundamental truth in the universe. We thought love was a survival mechanism, a sophisticated form of genetic strategy. We thought it required reason and would break under pressure. We thought it was conditional." "But it's not," Sarah said softly. "No," agreed. "You love without reason. You care beyond logic. You extend compassion to beings who can't repay you, to causes you'll never see completed, to creatures that aren't your species, even to enemies who have deliberately hurt you. And we've been so alone, for so long, feeding on emotions we never truly participated in, and we didn't even know we were alone because we had never experienced the alternative." Sarah stood up and did something that made every consciousness across the planet stop and focus completely. She hugged the ancient cosmic being. Her arms couldn't physically encompass its form. She was hugging light and consciousness itself, but the gesture was unmistakable. Care offered freely, without expectation, to a being that had just confessed to causing her species pain. "You're not alone anymore," she said. You're seen now, you're known. And yeah, you hurt people and that wasn't okay. But you're here now asking how to do better. That's what matters. That's where change starts. Finally had a word for what it was feeling. They had no name for it because they had never experienced it, but humans did. Grief. Overwhelming grief for the billions of years spent in isolation, for the countless opportunities for connection that it had missed, for the fundamental misunderstanding of what existence could be. But alongside the grief was something else, something that felt like dawn breaking after an endless night. Hope. The possibility that it wasn't too late to learn, to change, to become something other than what it had always been. Teach us, said to Sarah, its voice carrying to every consciousness simultaneously, a decision made by the collective in an instant. We are older than your civilization. We have knowledge spanning galaxies, but we don't know how to love without reason. We don't know how to care without benefit. Show us, please. Sarah smiled, the tired smile of someone who had spent decades caring for others and would spend decades more because that's who she was. Okay. First lesson starts the same way it always does. Tell me about yourself. Not what you are or what you can do, who you are, what you feel, what hurts, what brings you joy. I want to understand you. And so began the strangest lesson in the history of the universe. Ancient beings of pure consciousness, witnesses to the birth of galaxies, students of a young species that had barely left its own world. They learned that love wasn't about deserving or earning or logical exchange. It was about seeing another being and choosing connection over isolation, choosing care over indifference, choosing to believe that every consciousness that could feel deserved acknowledgement of that feeling. They learned that unconditional love wasn't weak or naive or impractical. It was possibly the most powerful force in existence because it could transform anything it touched, even beings who thought themselves beyond transformation. It could take ancient entities who had spent billions of years alone and show them what it meant to be part of something larger than themselves. Across Earth, humans continued to welcome not because the beings had earned it or deserved it or could offer anything in return. Just because they were there and they were suffering from eons of isolation, and humans possessed this strange, illogical, mathematically impossible capacity to care about that suffering. And the trembling with their newfound understanding finally began to understand what they had been hungering for all along. Not emotions to consume, but connections to forge. Not feelings to catalog, but relationships to build. Not observation, but participation in the vast, messy, painful, beautiful experience of existing not as isolated consciousness, but as beings genuinely connected to others. They had been feeding on love for billions of years without understanding it. Now, finally, they were learning how to love in return. And it was terrifying and overwhelming and completely irrational, and somehow the most right thing they had ever experienced. His grandmother brought out the chapati, and an ancient cosmic entity sat in a garden in Kenya, sharing food it didn't need with humans it had hurt, learning the first lesson of unconditional love. That connection begins not with grand gestures but with simple presence, with showing up, with saying, I see you and you matter, without requiring anything in return. And across the universe, something fundamental shifted. They would never be the same, and neither would humanity, now carrying the knowledge that their particular brand of illogical, unreasonable, unconditional love was powerful enough to transform even beings who had existed since the dawn of time.